with the talks. I don't know if our first speaker is already ready to kickstart and ready remotely, but the first talk is going to be from Gavin Buckingham. He's a professor at the University of Exeter in the UK, and he does really amazing work. He's kind of straddling between sports science, doing a lot of VR, lots of really crazy illusions and exciting work. I don't know exactly what he's going to present today, but immersive reality for quantifying upper limb movement in stroke survivors sounds like a really exciting topic. So I see that he's up on stage, so I'm going to leave the stage and leave you guys to hear what Gavin has to say. Gavin, take it away.
Hi, folks, and thanks for that introduction, Pedro. Really sad I couldn't be here today, but it's the start of term in the UK, so I'm getting to experience the unique double whammy of giving a research presentation at a conference and then giving a lecture immediately afterwards to a bunch of undergraduate students. So quite exciting to experience the full range of experiences that I get in a single day. But I will be sharing my screen now. All right, fabulous. Hopefully everyone can see the screen well enough and hear me okay. If not, someone just bellow into the microphone. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some work that we've been doing over the last few years, really looking at immersive virtual reality, not just as a mechanism to engage people, but also to capture aspects of their behavior. And this has kind of really been a key theme that I've been moving forward with this here. That I'm interested in motion capture. I'm interested in doing lab-based research, but it's really hard to get people into the lab. If you can bring the lab to people, then we have a whole new wide world of research possibilities. So, virtual reality, obviously we would define this as interacting with a computer-generated environment, but I want to kind of keep the emphasis here on interactions because that's really the key part of virtual reality in this context. And as far as I'm concerned, as a psychologist who's interested in how we use our hands to lift up objects, really I'm one of these people that feels that interacting is the thing that we do. All of our movements really are to underpin our ability to interact and manipulate our environment. And VR is this fantastic tool for science because it provides us not just with total control over environmental factors in fairly highly ecological valid tasks, such as shown really nicely in Mikhail's previous presentation there. But the very nature of virtual reality captures fairly easy measurements of a lot of what we do. The position of the head is being measured, the position of the hands holding controllers, and even the positions of individual digits in the fingers are being measured and captured, as well as in some cases eye movements fairly precisely with really high temporal and spatial resolution. And what I'm going to present here is some of the work that has been led by one of my PhD students, a guy called Jack Evans, who is a really talented student who sits right at the intersection of neuropsychology, cognitive science, and virtual reality development. He's a really skilled developer in Unity. He is funded by the EPSRC, one of the UK funding councils, with a focus on healthcare technologies. And his PhD, when he started it back in 2018, was focused on whether immersive virtual reality could be some kind of new way to help assess upper limb function in stroke survivors. So this is kind of the setup. It's taken a bit of a meandering path, but this is a sort of useful grounding, I think. So currently in the UK, if you've had a stroke, your performance over time will be tracked by a clinician. You'll go into a clinic and a nurse or a doctor will perform a bunch of different tests on you. These are tests you might well have heard of: the Fugl-Meyer test, action arm research test, Wolf motor function test. And these are pretty comprehensive, reliable, and validated tests, but they're a bit low tech, right? Really, we're sort of talking here about a questionnaire and someone asking the stroke survivor to hold out their arm, to lift up their arm, to twist their arm around, and these fairly functional things, and then scoring them on a scale of 0, 1, or 2. So this is kind of really all we've got to quantify the level of disability an individual has and their progress through various different types of rehabilitation. So obviously there's huge scope for pretty dramatic floor effects and for ceiling effects here, but perhaps more problematic is this lack of granularity, right? People could improve hugely, but this just wouldn't be picked up on their scores in any meaningful kind of way because it's not very precise. And this is where we thought virtual reality might sort of fill an interesting void here. Obviously, there's been a lot of work out there trying to use kinematic measurements, so using motion capture devices such as OptiTrack, OptiTrack, Vicon, the sorts of things that you would see in a typical biomechanics lab or my upper limb motion lab here. And these are useful, right? You can measure things very, very precisely, but the gap between what we can measure in the lab and the functional outcomes for an individual, it's huge, right? There's huge numbers of journal articles out there trying to find the magical task that we can measure in the lab and turn those numbers that we capture from our motion capture devices into something that has good face ecological validity for the sort of things that stroke survivors really care about getting better at. It's also something that's really never going to be clinically applicable. It's got a complicated, convoluted setup. It's expensive to set up. There are never going to be motion capture laboratories in medical clinics. The difference between these two worlds is just too far apart. But maybe virtual reality can help us bridge that gap here. Virtual reality provides these sort of fairly cheap, cheap and high quality visuals alongside fairly accurate tracking. So it's not as good as a motion capture laboratory, but it's pretty good. Certainly good enough to immerse people in these virtual worlds. And it's, customizable and adaptive. So it can be created as a sort of single package that can be branched out for children, for older people, for people of any different generation, or indeed to track someone's performance across time. So what would we do in virtual reality to try to capture someone's performance? We spent quite a lot of time messing around with maybe looking at some sort of box and block task or something like that in virtual reality. But what we settled on actually was a circle drawing task. Because circle drawing, it's a simple task, right? And being able to explain what you want to someone to do fairly simply is a really important part. If you're not in the virtual reality environment with them, you need to be able to articulate what you want. It's something that captures multi-joint coordination. To draw a circle, you need to be using feedback, feed-forward mechanisms, controlling the proximal and distal musculature in the arms. It also has been shown to correlate well with upper limb function in stroke survivors already. And maybe most importantly, it's a fun task, right? We've all tried to draw the perfect circle before. It's a pretty engaging thing to people to want to try and do. Right, so this was the plan. We developed this task and bring in some stroke survivors and let them experience this stuff. But then 2020 rolled around and the pandemic smushed everyone's big ambitions to be doing really interesting lab-based work. And certainly working with clinical populations was not at all feasible. But this time in all of our lives did coincide really conveniently with this glut of people owning a virtual reality headset all of a sudden. It went from being a niche technology you'd find in a very few rich person houses to 10 million estimated Oculus and then Meta Quest 2 headset users floating all around the world. And this all of a sudden opened up the door to the possibility of remote data collection. We don't need to be bringing people into the lab to put a VR headset on them. There's 10 million people out there who have a VR headset of their own, and all we need to do is send the experiment this way. I mean, I'm sort of preaching to the converted here. I think half the people in this room had the same idea in 2020, and there was a lovely online repository of experiments that we all took part in. I'm almost certain I'm talking to 7 or 8 of my participants at the moment. We were not comfortable with the idea of working with stroke survivors in a remote setting. I think that even if we did have stroke survivors who did have a VR headset, which we felt would be a fairly unlikely proposition, we certainly didn't like the idea of putting someone in a visually deprived environment for an experimental context. So we stepped away from that entirely and just sort of went more for a proof of principle idea, figuring that, well, individuals all have dominant and non-dominant hands, and if we can capture the differences between how well they perform with their dominant hand and their non-dominant hand, well, that's actually a pretty good indication that we're going to be having some really fine-grained granular measurements that are going to capture what we'd want to see when we eventually are able to take this into a more clinical population. So we advertised this study, put it online. My plans and expectations of us being able to collect data from 1,000 people were quickly dashed. And we ended up struggling to recruit 47 participants. Again, thank you if you took part in this experiment, and this all looks very familiar to you. So we had people download this custom-made Circle Tracer app onto their Meta 2 headset. And this provided the consent information to participants, and a little demonstration video allowed them to meet the team in this very nicely created space environment that Jack had created here. Something that was, we had to work really hard to make this a pleasant place to be in, a cool sort of environment, because otherwise you're just going to take your headset off and play Beat Saber or something like that instead. We gave people video instructions, practice trials, and then 16 trials per hand of drawing circles in this horizontal plane in a sort of interleaved fashion. So some trials they're drawing with their dominant hand, some trials they're drawing with their non-dominant hand, and they were drawing clockwise and counterclockwise in this kind of way. So all of the biomechanics were pretty well matched up. The kinematic data was automatically shipped back to a server in Jack's house, which was a complicated process from not just a technical but also an ethical perspective, but we got there in the end. And this yielded 37 complete data sets that were recorded at about 70 hertz apiece. We ended up having 33 right-handed individuals and 4 left-handed individuals. And we were able to derive a bunch of dependent variables from the position data that was collected here. We calculated the average velocity of the circle, the time it took to draw the circle, and the roundness of the circle, which is complicated to quantify, it turns out. We thought that was quite a simple thing beforehand, but it turns out there's a lot of people arguing on Wikipedia about the best way to calculate the roundness of a circle. However, we settled on a method. We averaged across those 16 trials for each of the hands so that we could see whether people drew circles in VR better with their dominant hand than their non-dominant hand. And what we found is that both hands were equally accurate in terms of how circular those circles were on average. There was really no difference here between, how well they were doing with their dominant and non-dominant hand. But people were drawing faster with their dominant hand. Their dominant hand was slightly faster than their non-dominant hand. So we find this evidence of quite an interesting speed-accuracy trade-off in terms of how people performed this task. But, we weren't really interested in understanding how people draw circles with their dominant and non-dominant hand. That was not the point of this study. This was really just to see if we could capture these fairly subtle differences in this remote context. And we could, right? But it certainly wasn't perfect, and I wouldn't want to give that impression. We had a very high dropout rate, so out of our 47 people who consented, we only got 37 complete data sets. And a lot of people downloaded the app who never gave us data in the first place, either because they didn't enjoy the experience much, or they got frustrated, or thought this was a stupid thing to do. The sorts of stuff you don't really have in the lab. It's also a very high bar to entry, right? I mean, even though there's 10 million VR headsets out there, well, we all know the demographics of those VR headsets users. So, we have a pretty homogeneous sample, although whether it's going to be any worse than we'd see in the lab in the southwest of England is hard to say. The data quality was also very variable. We have been doing some tests and stuff like that, but clearly the lighting in the room and the setup people have huge impacts on how well they perform and stuff like that. And you can see just some different examples here of a nicely collected set of data here with nice smooth velocity profiles compared to this sort of data with this huge jaggedy noise and stuff like that. And we had to come up with some pretty robust inclusion and exclusion criteria for trials where we just were not comfortable filtering it into something smooth and sensible looking. But the task does seem viable, and what Jack has been doing now over the last couple of years has been co-developing this task with stroke survivors, making it better, getting in the lab with people, finding out whether they enjoy the task, whether it seems sensible to them. And we have a feasibility study on this coming soon with a bunch of data that he has collected in the lab and hopefully in the clinic as well. Now, just before I finish as well, I want to sort of chat a little bit about some of the other directions we've been taking this in, because from this circle drawing task, we've really spun this off into a whole load of different directions. Mohammed Al Rashidi, another PhD in my lab who's recently submitted and defended his PhD, has been working with children who have cerebral palsy and has now done the circle drawing task in a bunch of typically developing children and in children with upper limb dysfunction from cerebral palsy, and found really beautiful looking correlations between how round the circles that these kids draw are and their performance on the box and block test, a standardized clinical assessment of someone's upper limb motor performance. So some really encouraging results there for how this circle drawing task might fit into the bigger diagnostic ecosystem. But even more exciting than that is some of the work that another master's student in our cohort, Jyoti Gupta, who is a physiotherapist from India, she took a VR headset back to India with her over the summer months and collected data from 60 different children across various different schools in India from a range of different demographics, the sorts of things that you would just not possibly get data from in a typical lab-based context. Now, a lot of this data, of course, is pretty disastrous because it's been collected in this slightly ad hoc kind of way outside of lab and really very, very far from ideal data collection conditions, but really exciting just to show that this thing is possible. And the last thing I want to chat about today is just to flag up some of the amazing work that's been done by Haoyang Du, who was a research assistant in my lab, who was hired by the Waterloo Foundation to develop a movement assessment for dyspraxic children. And this is work that's coming soon, but I thought it was cool enough now that I have some good videos to show you all of this. It's a battery of tests designed to assess the movement abilities, replicating the sort of thing that we see in lab-based assessments that, again, are all pencil, paper, and fairly clunky, but here providing fine-grained kinematic data. And I'm really sort of excited for the future here when we can, start taking on some of this mixed reality stuff that is becoming, for me, the really interesting part, solving a whole bunch of all the safety issues of people falling over and bumping into walls. And, we can sort of start to see the consumer gaming market here capturing a lot of the things that we would hope to capture here. And, if you're able to get movement kinematics and performance metrics from tasks like this alongside the more sensible measures of performance, well, there's some really exciting possibilities there. All right, well, thank you very much for listening. I gather we're not going to do any Q&A today, but I'm really enjoying watching along online. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, everybody.